two men were to be in and out of Congress for the next 50 years. Well, let's say 1811 to 1850, let's say 42 years. The next 40 years. Henry Clay ran for president 3 times and never got it. Calhoun ran for president once. Calhoun at least got to be vice president. These men served in the Senate for a while, but they favored going to war initially, so they got fame as war hawks. Later on, they were to get fame for the sides they took and the events that led up to the Civil War. Neither one of these men lived long enough to see the Civil War. Anyway, they were not able to prevent it. Madison said he would trade with both Britain and France if France would agree to stop the shipping. Napoleon said he agreed. But keep in mind, with all respect to Napoleon, without radios, without GPSs, it was difficult for Napoleon to even enforce his own laws. These ship captains would get out miles into the Atlantic and do whatever they felt like. So if the French did seize a few more American ships, then, in the meantime, in the West, the Indians began aligning themselves with England, sensing that England and the United States was about to go to war again. Governor William Henry Harrison tried to buy land from the Indian tribes. Governor William Henry Harrison took St. Clair's place as governor of Ohio. Tecumseh said that no Indian tribe owned any land. Folks, this was the big issue that separated the whites from the Indians. Private ownership of property. Now, the last time I taught this course, I asked the students to write a paper, and one of the questions I asked them to answer was, should we have open borders? And a surprising number of them said, if we just had open borders, there'd be peace on earth. Everybody should go and live anywhere he wanted to with no, the Indians had that, folk. They had open borders. And I see at least one of you strongly agrees with that. It did not lead to peace among them. And it ultimately let them just be overrun and conquered. But anyway, open borders. They said nobody, the Indians had no private ownership of property, so no Indian tribe owns any land. Nevertheless, Tecumseh went south. Tecumseh went to what is today Alabama and Mississippi in an attempt to persuade the Indians to unite and drive out the white man. While he was away, Governor Harrison purchased vast sums of land from the Indians at a price of about 2 cents an acre. Really cheap, even though Napoleon sold his land for about 2 cents an acre. Tecumseh learned the deals, he was furious. So he went south again to recruit more Indian tribes. He left Prophetstown in the care of his brother, named Prophetstown after his brother who was known as the Prophet. So Harrison decided that he would march on Prophetstown. Harrison is a future president now. The Indians attacked at Tippecanoe Creek. They were defeated. Prophetstown was burned. Now in 1840, when Harrison ran for president, the battle cry went up, Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe, as a memory of what Harrison had done. The Prophet's magical power was greatly diminished. Tecumseh became more determined than ever to fight. So then came the War of 1812. The war hawks were mostly young lawyers, men like Henry Clay from the west and John C. Calhoun from the south. Henry Clay was from Kentucky, Calhoun from South Carolina. They wanted war as a legitimate means to attack Indians and bring an end to impressment. And they wanted the United States to expand. Particularly, they wanted the United States to take Florida and Canada. We never got Canada. But basically, here's what happened. War was declared. The British were accused of looking down on the United States as a third-rate power. The Americans never got over the song Yankee Doodle. I mean, I didn't mention it, but Yankee Doodle was written during the French and Indian War, making fun of the Americans. But anyway, war was declared and the war started. The United States began with an attempt to take over Canada. The United States attacked Canada. They were met by a smaller army, but the American general got spooked. He was old anyway. The American general got spooked and the attempt failed. The New England states did not cooperate, so we could not use New England as a base of operation. Madison won the election of 1912, but by a very narrow margin. Well, the war hawks said we could easily whip Great Britain. This proved to not be true. But late in 1812 and early 1813, the tide of war turned. The United States won a bunch of battles, particularly the USS Constitution. Now, the USS Constitution was commissioned when the United States prepared for war with the Barbary pirates. And it went and it served in fighting and shelling the Tripoli, the capital of the Barbary countries. The Constitution had a hull that was 11 inches thick, and when cannonballs hit, they would bounce off. That's why it got called Old Ironsides. When I was 10 years old, my dad bought a model of the Constitution, which we put together for a time, but then we lost interest in it. And eventually that model was destroyed. The same model is still being sold today. You can find it in Hobby Lobby. I just don't have the patience to try to put it together anymore. Anyway, the Constitution defeated several British ships because the British could not penetrate its hull with their cannon fire. Then Americans burned York in Canada, which is now the city of Toronto. Oliver Hazard Perry. I happened to go to school with a man named Perry, well, this classmate named Perry, who said he was descended from Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry got together a bunch of schooners and they went to Lake Erie and defeated the British at Lake Erie. General Harrison then drove the British out of Detroit and defeated them at the Thames, where the Tecumseh was killed. Then Andrew Jackson defeated the Indian South. Folk, we've got to elaborate on this a little bit. One of the Democratic presidential candidates has said if she's elected, she'll take Andrew Jackson's picture down because Andrew Jackson was an Indian fighter. But the Indians provoked Jackson. Jackson and his wife could not have children, so they adopted a Creek Indian boy. But then the Indians provoked Jackson because 500 women and children went to a fort for protection. The Indians attacked the fort and killed all 500 of them. The cry went up, "Let fearless Judge Jackson take command." Jackson knew how to command an army. Jackson was sent south. He defeated the Indians, chased them all the way into Florida, in fact. And then even went inside Florida, even though Florida was Spanish territory, went inside Florida. Well, so with 1813 going in the Americans' favor, the British took up an offensive in 1814. They went up Chesapeake Bay, got toward Washington, and then the Madisons were sitting down to a meal when all of a sudden they got the news, the British are here. Mrs. Madison quickly grabbed George Washington's portrait and ran. President Madison got together a bunch of militiamen to try to fight the British, but the British panicked. James Madison is the only president in history who personally led troops into fighting. The only one, and his troops lost badly. Anyway, the British burned the president's mansion, burned the Capitol, and burned a lot of other buildings. The president's mansion was repaired and painted over, and that's why it's called the White House. They painted it with white paint. Before that, it was called the President's Mansion. And it was to stand for about 100 years until it rotted to the point where serious repairs were done on it during the administration of Harry Truman, but that was to come later. But anyway, the British then marched toward Baltimore, and I don't run out of time, but I've got to talk about this. The British fired on Fort McHenry, And at Fort McHenry was a flag about as big as the back wall here. I've seen the flag. The flag has some holes in it. Well, but before they fired, as night was falling, they captured a man named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was taken on board a British ship because the British did not want him telling them that they were there, telling the Americans that they were there. So Francis Scott Key went on board a British ship. He was allowed to look over the ramparts, and he knew there were American prisoners held in a hold down below. So every once in a while, Francis Scott Key would go down and say, "Our flag is there." Now, as the sun went down, and the only light there was, this was a dark, moonless night, the only light there was when a rocket was fired. Francis Scott Key looked, yep, the flag is still there. He'd tell the men below, the flag is there. When a bomb was let off and burst in the air, the British would fire a bomb and burst in the air. By the light of the bombs bursting in the air, Francis Scott Key could see it. But 2 hours before daylight, the shelling stopped. Francis Scott Key thought surely Fort McHenry must have surrendered. He didn't know the British had given up on firing Fort McHenry. But then, as the sun came up, before the sun was actually up, when the sun lit up the upper atmosphere, and any of you who watch the sunrise know what I mean. The sun lights up the upper atmosphere, and the night turns to day. By the dawn's early light, Francis Scott Key could see that the flag was still there. He was so inspired by it that he wrote a poem about it. The poem was made into a song. The song was made into our national anthem. By the rocket's red glare, by the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And yes, the Star-Spangled Banner still waves. Now, one more thing. The words "play ball" that you'll hear at the end of the Star-Spangled Banner are not actually in the textbook. In case you hear the Star-Spangled Banner and when it's over, somebody says "play ball," that's not part of the text. All right. All right, everybody, have a good couple of days. I hope to see you on Wednesday.